It's an interesting question, though, because it gets to the real root or the center of our individual expression as artists, as musicians. Like, why does someone play the way they do? And it's everything that they've experienced or that they've really taken in and really checked out and tried to play. And it's those things that, get carried over into your music. At least from my experience, that's what it is.
Welcome to episode 126 of the Bass Shed Podcast. My name is Ryan Roberts. All right, what's happening, folks? Dan Lakin called me earlier this week, and for regular listeners, you probably have heard me talk about Dan Lakin, the founder of Lakeland Basses and D. Lakin Basses. Now, I haven't been, talking about those basses for some time. That's because I think Dan got out of the game. Like, Dan just kind of stopped with D. Lakin basses. I thought they were cool basses, right? Him and I co-designed one together that I talked about sometimes on the podcast here. It's a 5-string fretless, and I've seen one in the wild. I finally saw one in the wild. I was at the Baked Potato not too long ago, and Pete Griffin was playing one when I went to go check him out. So they're out there. It's like a Bigfoot sighting. If you see a D. Lakin bass, it's a rare thing. But it's nice to know that they're out there in the world. Anyways, Dan called me, and he had some questions for me. Him and some friends have an idea for a podcast. It's actually a really cool idea, and he wanted to just get some information from me about podcasting and stuff like that. Podcasting, whatever I know about it. Like, I'm no Joe Rogan over here, but I told him what I knew about it. Anyways, I think it's a really cool idea, and so, I hope that idea comes out. Anyways, he was asking about the podcast. He's like, I haven't checked it out in a little while. Who do you got coming on? Who have you had? Blah, 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 blah. I told him about this episode here with Marc Egan. I told him about the past episodes and then some episodes that are coming up in the future and who the guests are. And Lakin's 2 cents, Dan Lakin's 2 cents was like, hey, take it easy on the jazz guys, huh? That's what Dan said. Now, all right, Dan. I'm putting you on blast publicly here. 1, I know Dan won't have a problem with this. 2, if he does, he can call. I don't personally just do jazz guys. I want to talk about this. I don't personally just reach out to jazz guys, right? I get contacted by PR companies from all over the nation. That's taken a big, I don't have to go searching for bass players, which is nice. They hit me up. They want me to talk to their guests about new albums and stuff like that. So, some of them happen to be jazz guys, right? Jazz guys are putting out records. So, jazz guys have PR people talking about the record. There's that. All right. So I just wanted to do a public service announcement that was inspired by Dan Lakin's 2 cents. That this is not a jazz-based podcast. It's not that. I don't think, that podcast could be successful too much. Right? How much more niche of a podcast can you be than just talking to bass players? Anyways, Dan, I love you, man. I love you, man. And, sorry if you're not connecting with all the jazz players. But honestly, I think, Dan Lakin, you should be checking out some of these records, and you might learn some stuff. Or not. That's fine, too. But I wanted to talk about that. I will have more news about Dan Lakin's podcast if and when there is news to share. I hope he does release it. I think it's a great concept for a podcast. It is the music podcast, of course. And I hope him and his friend, decide to move forward on it. It's a really cool idea, and I will have more information about that in and when there is more information to share.
Hi, this is Jerry Jamont. I want to tell you about my upcoming book of bass transcriptions, JJ's Jukebox, Volume 1. This is a collection of over 15 of my bass lines in standard notation and tablature. They are accurately done here by Ryan Roberts of the Bass Shed Academy. Each transcription is accompanied by a video where I talk about what was happening during the recording session, how I got involved, and how I approached each song. Stop by the BassShedAcademy.org to learn more about my book of transcriptions, JJ's Jukebox Volume 1, and purchase a signed copy of my memoirs, Make It Happen.
My guest on the episode is bassist Marc Egan. This was a huge deal for me to have Marc Egan on the podcast. He's a bass player I've been following for a long time. As someone who plays primarily fretless bass, Marc Egan is someone that I've definitely been checking out. I have him on so many records. I've transcribed him a lot in my personal time. Marc Egan, I've been really checking out Marc for a lot of years. So it was an honor to have him on the podcast. Marc Egan is an accomplished American jazz bassist, known for his work as a session musician and his contributions to various influential jazz and fusion ensembles. Born on January 14th in Massachusetts, Marc Egan developed an early interest in music, initially starting with the trumpet before switching to the bass guitar during his teenage years. He studied at the University of Miami, where he further honed his musical skills and became involved in the local jazz scene. Became a founding member of the Pat Metheny Group, contributing to their first 3 albums, including the Grammy-winning Off Ramp in 1982. In addition to his work with these high-profile groups, Egan had a prolific solo career, releasing several albums under his own name that showcase his lyrical and melodic approach to the bass. He's also been an in-demand session player, working with a diverse array of artists across various genres, including Sting, Joan Osborne, and Roger Daltrey. Egan's contributions to the world of jazz and fusion music have earned him a respected place among his peers, and his work continues to inspire musicians and listeners alike. It was a huge, huge honor, as I mentioned, to have him on the podcast. And here is my talk with jazz and fusion electric bassist Marc Egan. What are you up to? I know you just came out with a new record that we're going to talk about, but what's a day in the life of Marc Egan? What's Marc Egan up to?
Today I went to the eye doctors just for a checkup. Everything's good.
Okay.
Good. Yesterday I was out on a boat, and before that I was up recording with the drummer from The Doors, John Densmore. I did a record with him, with Adam Holtzman and Arjun Brugman, a percussionist, great tabla, multi-percussionist drummer.
Oh, very cool. Whose record is that?
I think Adam Holtzman, the keyboard player who played with Miles Davis, he sort of spearheaded it, but I think it's going to be a joint thing with he and John Densmore. We actually recorded a few of the Doors songs.
Nice.
End of the Night and Crystal Ship, and then we did some Miles Davis covers, or if you could call it a cover, but some grooves from Miles Runs the Voodoo Down.
Okay.
From Bitches Brew. So
that sounds like a fun project.
Yeah, it's a wide assortment. My thing is I do a lot of different things at different times, and but always engaged and always playing,
Yeah, that's great. That quote right there we're gonna come back to, because there's a lot of influences I heard on your latest record that I want to talk to you about.
Sure.
Where do you live? Like, what part of the country or world are you in?
Well, I live in the wintertime down in Florida, South Florida.
Okay.
In North Palm Beach, Jupiter area. It's on the East Coast, about 60 miles north of Miami.
Okay.
And in the wintertime, I'm up in Connecticut, in the Northeast, near New York.
Okay. Man, did you catch any of that eclipse today?
I didn't get any of it here. Where are you calling
from? I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay.
So cool. There's like as far as the eclipse is related, like the maximum coverage would have been like 57%. We saw it, and that was around let's see, it's a little after 1 here. That was like 10 o'clock this morning. Is when you could start to see the shift, but I've been like kind of following a little bit. This stuff's kind of fascinating to me.
Yes.
And I know that it was, cutting through Texas and going up into the Northeast. So I didn't know, if you caught any of it or what it was like up there.
I think I was getting my pupils dilated at that time. So it would have been the worst time.
That's kind of the same, actually. That's like impersonal.
It is. No, but, if I looked at the sun, I would have been cooked,
Yeah.
So I didn't see it, but I was watching it on the news. Fascinating. I remember, Ryan, that I wanted to see back because there was a full eclipse in Miami when I was going to the university to study music in 1970. Okay. I went back to the history of full eclipses in Florida, and that was it. It was March 8th. 1970. So I actually saw one before, Full Eclipse.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it was interesting.
That's cool. Fantastic new record. Fantastic new record.
Thank you. Cross Currents. That's the one. Yep.
Yeah, Cross Current came out March 11th this year, 2024.
Yes.
For the listeners that haven't checked it out yet, it's 11 tracks, and these are all composed by you?
No, there 6 of them were composed by me. I co-wrote a song with Shane Theriot, the guitar player. It's a trio record.
Yeah.
And Sean Pelton is playing drums.
Mm-hmm.
Sean contributed 1 song, and Shane contributed 3, and we co-wrote 1.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's all original music from us, from the band.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, fantastic stuff, man. I've been following you for a long time. Like, you've been a big inspiration to me, and I'm sure many others. And I think for this record, we can expect the same things that we've loved from your previous records. What I like about your records, specifically as a bass player, is that they're not super. Now there's a lot of bass melodies on this record, but it's not like a bass chops in your face bass record. It's the approach to this record, and I feel like many others, is it's about the collective, it's about the group that maybe honors the bass more than other guitar trios would. In this case, guitar trio. But it's a very approachable album. It's very, very much, I think the tunes lend themselves to that. There's several tunes on here that almost sound like they're instrumental arrangements of pre-existing pop tunes. Like, it's that melodic and even structurally formatted that way. It's beautiful stuff.
Thank you.
How much of that is in the back of your mind when putting together material in your writing process, like how you approach form, how you approach melody, things like that?
Sure, it's a good question, and a lot of time was spent in pre-production and planning on this record. It was about a total of 9 months from the time that I decided I wanted to do a trio record with these particular people. And I started thinking about material and writing things. And Shane, the guitar player, had sent me some of his songs to get ideas. And eventually Sean sent one of his, and Shane and I were going back and forth. I really liked what Shane had sent me. And they're very much like you described. They're tuneful, but they sound like they could be covers of a pop tune. Or they're just very listenable music.
Yeah,
it wasn't too head turning as far as harmonically or melodically or improvisationally. But we spent a great deal amount of time just going over those and arranging them, going back and forth. I spent a lot of time arranging and a lot of pre-production because, as you mentioned, there are 11 songs, and we did the whole record in 3 days.
Oh, wow.
And so that's a lot of time in the studio.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of time in the studio, but it's a lot of songs to do in that amount of time.
Yes. It's 3 days. So, it's 3 days. I mean, consecutive 3 days back to back.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a lot of time while you're in the middle of 3 days. It feels like a lot of time in the studio, but to get through this much material, and this isn't for people that haven't checked out the record yet. The album is not a 3 guys in the room feel. There's multi-tracking here. There's layers. It's a very full sounding record with trio personnel. So it's not just, a trio calling tunes or reading down a lead sheet or anything.
Right. And one of the things when I was titling the record, it's called Cross Currents. It's Marc Egan Cross Currents with Shane and Sean. I'm the leader of the group. But the intent was, when we did lay down tracks, we played as a trio. We didn't punch our parts in. We were all in the same room playing, and we wanted it to be as much of a live playing experience as possible. And then after the fact, we went right after and overdubbed like melodies, guitar parts, bass parts, etc. And I wanted to do as much homework ahead of it in terms of by the time we rehearsed one day before, and at my home studio nearby the studio, which is the Power Station New England studio, which is, for people who don't know the Power Station studio, it's a great studio in New York City that became called avatar after a while, but this is an exact duplicate of that studio, of the great power station. And it's in Connecticut near my house. And I wanted to do it there to get away from the city and just to really focus on it. But so I knew that we had limited time in the studio with so much material, and I wanted to do as much pre-production to make it easy when we went in so that we could really focus on our playing and have a backdrop sketch of, we pretty much had all the forms happening, the roadmap, so to speak, of the, the intro is going to be this, where the solos are going to be. We tweaked them a little bit during the rehearsal day, but pretty much those charts, which I then did the calligraphy and Sibelius, were ready to go. So you could go in the studio and read them. There were basic chords, but specific bass lines that I had come up with open parts because I like that. And so by the time we were in the studio, we knew where there were going to be overdubs. I had made notes on those charts that the guys had ahead of time, 3 or 4 weeks. It said, in the A section, let's underdub, overdub, some guitar rhythm, some guitar swells, this and that. And likewise with bass, I want to have bass melody on this bridge, on the first bridge. And with drums, think about this, maybe put some percussion on these parts. So there was a lot of pre-planning, which I've always been in all the productions that I've done of my records and other people that I've produced. I'm very much into taking care of the homework ahead of time, but with leaving the space where people can be and create what they do, what their best part of what they are.
Sure.
And with these guys, Sean and Shane, I got to tell you, they did ridiculous amount of homework. When they came to the rehearsal and basically to the session, they had come up with their own ideas underneath that they were going to do in the sections that we thought about, that I had thought about, as well as new sections, things that they had, which is exactly what I was hoping. Shane had rehearsed or practiced different melodies and sections where I wanted him to take the melody, like on there's a tune called Pocket Call, which is he played the second melody. So he came in prepared. He wasn't practicing in the studio, or none of the guys were. They knew what they wanted. And even to the point where Shane or Sean, the drummer, I go back, Shane and Sean, that's the tough.
Yeah.
But so much so that in the studio, I would just say, well, Sean, what are you going to play in the kick on the bridge to this song? And he goes, I'm going to play this, boom, 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 boom. And so it just laid out my part, because I didn't want to write too many bass parts, because I know that Sean's groove would dictate the pocket where I want to fit in. And I knew what the harmony was as far as the chords. And I did have some basic ideas for the title track, Cross Currents. That bass line was, I wrote the whole song around that from, a bass line. So it was very well pre-thought about, and also a heavy focus in the studio to get as much of the live energy, like you were saying. This isn't just a trio playing one time through, but it's a trio playing one time through, but then we layered it and textured it. And you had mentioned about that it's not a bass player's record, bass player. It's not a fancy, I didn't want to do a lot of soloing everywhere and playing. I wanted to be musical with it and just make the songs come to life. And I did want to keep the identity of it, so when you put it on the record, you could say, well, hopefully that's a Marc Egan record, or that sound, So there's a lot of fretless, and there's a lot of bass melodies on that. But it was more for the music, just whatever the songs required.
No, and I think that's wonderful. And I think, two, at least for me personally, two artists and bass players I would always check in with for records like that are yourself and your records, and Mark Johnson, the records he did, the Bass Desire records. Like they're just music. It's not, there's no strong agenda with like, check me out. Here's me playing, giant steps in some crazy time signature to prove a thing. Or to maybe not prove, just showcase a thing would be a better verbiage. But it's really just, it's music. It's enjoyable music with the through line and a story that's engaging all the way through.
Well, I'm glad that you picked it up like that, because that's what I was going for, we were going for, was to do
Cool.
exactly that. And you know, I got to say, it's one of the few records that I've done that I can still listen to now. Like when I go to the gym with earbuds or whatever.
Yeah.
Usually I'm completely saturated by the time we finish mastering a record. I've heard it so much, I know every note, but this one, it's just, it's one that I can listen to, which is good.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
For a change.
Now this is your 21st album as a leader?
I believe so.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say some of those of the 21 are included with Danny Gottlieb with the group Elements that we co-produced, but this is actually my 9th one as a complete leader. Okay.
Now coming back to what you just said, after when you do a record, you spend so much time listening to it, and you do, you know, every note in and out, both, you know, things you liked and things you don't. If there was like a little blurb on it, like, I wish I would have done that better, you hear it every time. I know that from doing my own.
Yeah.
How do you, when coming up with new material, how do you kind of not end up being influenced by another record or something you've played? Because after listening to something, anything, so much, it's in there, you know, and like we all have a personal style, so there's a foundational element of like it's always going to be your style of playing and producing and creating music, but to where it's not, you know, this tune on this album sounds like a tune from 5 years ago on a previous record.
Of mine, you mean?
Yeah, just keeping a freshness in creating records and tunes.
Well, yes, this record is a fresh one for me in that it's a very different direction than other records. If you listen to my other solo records, they tend to be more soundscape, more based on the only fretless sound, not as much of as heavy of a groove. So this was a departure, and someone reviewed it and said this is a shocking departure or something. But to me, it's a very natural evolution for me to do this, and it's not really that different from my other records in that it's very melodic. There's a lot of solos that I do in it that are very much like other things, but I think the identity of this one has to do with the groove. And I think Sean Pelton and Shane brought in their expertise of being such great R&B studio players. Shane is from New Orleans. He's got the New Orleans funk, but he's also influenced by John Scofield, and a very great jazz guitar player. So he's very flexible, but he's the musical director for Daryl Hall of Hall & Oates.
Okay.
So he's playing that, you know, Daryl's, the Hall & Oates type of music a lot. And Sean, having done Saturday Night Live for 30 plus years, and I've done a lot of session work in New York with him, just doing all kinds of things from movies, soundtracks, records, jingles. But they're just such groovers. So I think that's the real different thing. Because in the past, on my solo records, I've used my partner in crime, Danny Gottlieb, the great Danny Gottlieb drummer, who we played together with the Pat Metheny Group. And we have a very special rapport, Danny and I. And musically, the last record previous to the one that was just released is called Electric Blue, and it's just drums and bass. It's a duo record, drums and bass. And it explores more of a very open space, more of the ECM record labels. It's from Germany originally. So this one is very different, and it's again, this is more of a tuneful record rather than other records where I've created more of a backdrop and we've improvised over them. This one was about the songs.
Yeah, when you talk about feels and Shane being from Louisiana, like the first tune right out of the gate has a second line feel to it. There's another tune later on the record that sounds like it's heavily influenced by the meters. There's a tune that sounded to me with a strong Motown influence, and the first kind of track reference that came to mind when listening to it was Cruisin' by Smokey Robinson. And so it was kind of coming from a lot of places. And then there's a tune on there that sounds like it could have been written by Sting. Like it had that kind of feel to it. And so there's I felt like a lot of connecting elements throughout the record, but also there's a lot of diversity within like how far you can reach within that scope and within that groove based approach.
Yes. And I think a lot of that was really spending time on choosing the tunes and composing the tunes, because when Shane had sent me some of his songs, a few of them, I really liked them. He had a rough demo, and then I lured him into Pro Tools, and I played and I wrote some melodies over it and played a lot of the parts. Homebrew is one of them where I played the groove on that. And likewise, I started listening to Shane's last couple records, and it inspired me to write a certain way, in my own way. So I just sort of heard the groove. I took the tempos down, and was inspired by that. And then I would start writing, and I write a lot on bass and on keyboard. And I came up with just ideas and kept expanding on them like that. So, yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, so I think that's also what makes it a lot different, because other times I could put together a record in a couple months or something, but this one I really took a lot of time, and I did demos for everything from of all the songs. And Shane had done a demo of Pontchartrain, which is that first take, the first song that you said sounds Louisiana. That's Lake Pontchartrain. So yeah, that's the way that the compositional process came together with it. And Sean contributed another funky groove called Nonk Rodell, which is a tribute to his uncle Nonk.
Okay. That one was fascinating to me because that one starts with just solo bass, and then the way the drums come in to the tune is very not like anything that has been established by the drum chair on the record previously. They kind of just come rolling in with this kind of haphazard feel. It was really fascinating.
It was interesting. Sean recorded the drum track at his studio in New York, and then I played along to a click at the beginning and just played that melody, and then he came in with just drums, but he's actually playing the melody, but it's like Elvin Jones. And he studied jazz before he got into playing rock and R&B. He's an amazing drummer. I mean, on that track, when he sent me that track, we had already had most of the songs picked, but he sent me his demo of it. And I just called him up. I said, "Yes, man, you're killing, you are killing." I wanted to have something like this on the record that really featured his looseness, but it's not just if you really listen to his drums, the way that he's syncopating and his technique on his hands, it's ridiculous. Great player.
Now, also on that track, correct me on the pronunciation of this. Nonk Rodell?
Nonk Rodell, yes.
Okay. There's an accordion sound.
Yes, there's accordion, and that was played by Sean, the drummer. Okay. And he also did the background guitar parts on tenor guitar, I think it was. He did 3 guitar parts, and those were all on the tracks when I did my parts. I overdubbed when we got in the studio. And then Shane, when we were in the studio, played his guitar on top of that and soloed. Okay. So, Sean set us up. It was a setup.
What?
It was a setup. It was ready. It just was oozing of the vibe, because that accordion was there strong in that.
What was the relevance of the accordion? It seems like such a I don't know, outlier instrument to choose.
Yeah, well, it's fitting in that it's
very fitting for the track. It's great. Yeah.
Of the New Orleans Zydeco type of, way out back sound.
Yeah.
So that's why it's just the way he composed the track. He heard that sound and a rootsy sound and came up with those guitar parts.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And then it was actually the next track on the album that is the one for me, had that kind of Motown-y Smokey Robinson feel, a tune called Sandcastles.
Yes. And that was a song that I wrote, Sandcastles. It started with just a bass lick, which, it's just an R&B lick, basically, that I was practicing one day. So Ryan, what I do is I just with my phone, I have that voice recorder memo, whatever.
Oh, sure.
Voice memo, little app that's on everybody's iPhone. And usually in the morning when I'm practicing, the first thing I do is I get up and I'll be playing and just warming my fingers up. And if I stumble across something, and when I'm thinking about doing a record, everything is sort of focused on getting ideas for the record. So I'll just turn it on,
Everything's
play a
fair
bit.
Game. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I just record it and I'll say the date and I'll say as much about my concept of what I think should be on that particular groove. And so that was Sandcastles. And I just kept extending that groove. And then I eventually went to a bridge, but it was just started from that one groove. And then I got a drum loop in my Pro Tools here because I did a lot of the pre-production. I did the demos here at this studio. I'm in Florida right now.
Okay.
But I have a much more elaborate studio up in Connecticut, and I just bring up the files and the Pro Tools, and it all goes down. So that song, the basic groove was just I played some bass chords, a bass melody, and I had the bass groove underneath it, and that's what we did. And then I extended the solo section. It goes to a B minor section, I think. But it's interesting. It's basically the changes to all along the Watchtower, the chord changes, but then it modulates up a fourth, and it sounds like, and then it goes back to the original key. Mm-hmm. And it was for me, it was an eye-opening thing to modulate it. And that was the change of solo, is when I come in with my solo was the modulation. It's sort of a lift. And I like that concept a lot. So.
Cool.
But it's very much a Marc song. The type of melody, the chords that I played in the background is what Shane played on his guitar, and then he, of course, embellished it beautifully. But yeah.
I don't know what period to reference during this question or how to necessarily answer this question. But what were the influences to really come up with vocal like playing? Would you play along with the vocal tracks from old records when you're developing this concept of sound and this approach that it's a style you're so known for now?
Well, I have to go back in my career because I originally was a trumpet player in junior high school and high school, and I went to the University of Miami as a trumpet major, applied music major in the jazz school. Okay. And I was listening to people like in 1969 when I went there, to Miles Davis and all the trumpet players, Clifford Brown, Freddie Hubbard, and I was especially enamored by Miles Davis. I just was so into Miles and listening to all of the bands that played with him. So I have an inherent attraction to melody, because that's what on trumpet, you have to articulate a melody, and you're dealing with shaping a sound with vibrato and, getting a rich sound out of the horn. And when I started playing bass, when I was 16, and when I got down to Florida, I transferred all my trumpet information as far as theory and melody over to the bass. So I really approach it from ahead, the way that I can see when I hear a melody, similar to the way that I would on trumpet. And I can't say that I listen to a lot of singers necessarily to develop my melodicism on the bass. It's mostly just applying my sensibilities from having experience playing trumpet and then applying that to bass. So,
right.
And when you think about it, Ryan, there's so many ways to play the same melody. You could approach the notes from below a little bit, especially on fretless bass. It's wide open because there's no frets to block it. So there's a lot of room for expression, for vibrato, which I don't use a lot of vibrato because vibrato can be annoying to me sometimes when I hear players playing with too much, or singers. It's just too much. But
I mean, there's a.
I'm not going to mention any names.
I was trying to figure out a way to say that I'm not mentioning names, and then
but I'll just
Yeah, there's like three singers that come to mind right off the top. I will edit this part out. But Stevie Nicks, Aaron Neville, singers like this where it's just like boom, that vibrato, it's a little overkill.
Yeah.
And
I love
part
them,
of their
though,
sound.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I
I understand what you're saying. That
Frank
happens.
Sinatra doesn't have it. Frank's got a very beautiful, amazing way that he does very little vibrato, but it's not like, whereas Tony Bennett's, "Hey, I love my heart," and I love Tony, but it's just, for me, on the instrument, it takes away from it. So, but yeah, so that's how it's in my spirit, in my soul, in my sensibilities, the way that I approach a melody. And it's the same way with playing a groove. It's everything I've ever experienced. And, I'm applying myself to whatever is being called for at the moment. In this case, with the trio record, grooving with Sean. So it's an interesting question, though, because it gets to the real root or the center of our individual expression as artists, as musicians. Like, why does someone play the way they do? And it's everything that they've experienced or that they've really taken in and really checked out and tried to play. And it's those things that, get carried over into your music. At least from my experience, that's what it is.
We'll be back right after this.
Right, the middle of the show, features are brought to you by the International Society of Bassists, commonly referred to as ISB. Stop by isbworldoffice.com for everything you need to know about latest news, happening, events, what have you. Information on players, albums, all kinds of wonderful things. isbworldoffice.com. Folks, for listeners that have been with me since the early days of the podcast, my guest on episode number 5 was Gary Wicks. Gary Wicks now has a new group titled Is That You? The band Is That You has a new EP out. EP is a collection of 4 cinematic instrumentals with nods to 70s funk, and it also incorporates modern electronic elements. It has this overarching feel of just like throwback crime story music. You'll know what I mean when you listen to it. You absolutely should. EP Split 5 Ways is really killing. I hope you all take a few minutes to check it out. It is on all the major streaming platforms. I will have a link to it in the show notes. Again, the group is titled Is That You? And their debut EP is titled Split 5 Ways. Check it out. Folks, I got to let you know about a new podcast I've been digging on, the Craft Brewed Music Podcast. This podcast presents interviews for serious listeners, drawn from and inspired by boutique craft brewed music discovery app. Some of the world's greatest and off the beaten path musicians discuss their work. Hosted by Craft Brewed Music founder Brian Horner and Craft Brewed Music artist Aaron Stamen. The podcast is produced twice monthly. Subscribe to the show wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts and check out craftbrewedmusic.com.
Excellent, sir.
What kind of process did you go through to feed that? Because I feel like musicians can either understand what innately comes out and you can just feed, your natural instincts, or you can try to, you're like, well, yeah, like I sound like this, like I'm a melodic player, but I really want to be this thing and do all this bebop stuff. So like, you just shedding the Omni book at 400 or something, but that's not really where you're coming from. What process did you go through to feed the melodic nature of your natural instincts?
Well, I think one way is when I'm practicing, working on fretless, say, just particularly on or even on fretted. You don't have. You can play melodically on a fretted bass, and I do all the time. It's it's a different. It's a little. They're different instruments, but the same. But I do, when I'm practicing, I may take out the real book, which is a jazz fake book that has, people don't know what that is. It's just a lot of jazz standards, and there's many of those books and melodies that are of great melodies that are written by the great songwriters of all time are in there. And I'll just try to play it and try to play around it and just come up with different ways of approaching it and fingerings. And that opens a whole world of, left hand, right hand. A lot of times I play mostly with my index and middle finger in the right hand. And so I've worked out a lot of right hand exercises because to get really good articulation, to be able to play a note, it's in both hands, but you're setting the string in motion for the most part in the right hand, even though with pull-offs in the left hand, you do as well. But so sometimes I would play a simple melody and I realized I can't really play this melody the way I want to because I'm getting stuck in the right hand. And so I'll just focus on what strings I'm playing to play the melody. And then I won't play the left hand. I'll just play harmonics at the 12th fret. And then I'll just play whatever strings play that melody and see where I'm getting stumbled. And if I can get through that, then I know that I've got the right hand. But not only that, I'll play it not only starting on the index, but I'll do the same thing starting on the middle finger. So I'm playing it backwards.
Sure.
And so I'm trying to get a universal technique in the right hand, which is something that a great guitar player, Joe Giorio, who used to teach out at MIT in California, taught me early on when I was down in Florida going to school. He was out sitting under a tree near the practice building, and I walked over and I said, "Hey, Joe, what's going on?" Because he wasn't there. He was just there playing or to meet someone. He goes, "Hey, Mark, man, I'm just working on right hand today. I'm just doing like 8 hours of just right hand." And I said, "Wow," it took me back. And I said, "That's interesting." He said, "Yeah, you really got to work on your right hand if you really want to be able to articulate the instrument." So that's, when you're asked what's involved with learning melodies or expanding your concept of playing melodies, that's one thing. And then, of course, in the left hand, figuring where you can play it, where it sounds right on different strings, what's the best way to play it, and then starting slow with it and then gradually building it up. If it's a faster melody, if you're playing Donna Lee, be able to play it really slow, but you've got to be able to know the fingerings of it. And you have to slow it down. You've got to start with the basic thing of what tempo you can play it at. And I practice with a metronome all the time. I'm not going to mention any names, but I practice
for people that need to practice with the metronome more. Is that on are those on the hit list?
No, some teachers are against metronomes, and I'm all for a sense of time, and it's very important.
Yes.
But more so than just the sense of the metric time is the feel. So, you've got the technical aspect of getting the melody together and then the feel of it. And if it's a melody that's like a swinging type of thing, feeling the triplets, boom, boom, bing, or even in a bass line, if you're just walking bass line, if playing quarter notes, you really have to feel it like you're playing triplet, the first note of a triplet. Or triplet, so that you're feeling the subdivision to really feel what the subdivision is of the groove.
For sure.
So there's all those things. It's it's not just playing a melody, but playing it with expression, and then playing it with dynamics is the icing on the cake, because when we're talking here, we're not just talking like this all the time in monotone. At least I'm trying not to.
Right.
But you're talking like and so all those things go into the complexity of playing a melody or playing a solo, which is playing a melody, improvising a melody. Yeah. So those are some of the techniques for me that I've worked on and I continue to work on. And I also work on a lot of modal studies and diatonic studies, which diatonic means the within a certain modality or a certain key center, it's the harmony that's inside of it. So I'll practice a lot of scale tones and chord tones and chords within different scales. A major scale, you have all the different modes of that. But if you take a melodic minor scale, it's a whole nother thing, and it's a very colorful scale, or harmonic minor. So within those are beautiful melodies, and so I come up with studies for myself that have all those different ideas in them. So those are some ways that I've done practice melodies.
I think it's great that you spoke to right hand technique. I just got done shooting a video, a lesson kind of online thing video about right hand technique because I think it's so undervalued and under, for the lack of a better term, broadcast about like things to dig into. I mean, ultimately, it's always about both of our hands working together, but to have the dexterity in the right hand is just as important as having dexterity in the left hand. And I'm glad you brought that up. And the whole thing, the video series I just did. Well, it's one video actually. It just felt like a series because it took me forever to shoot it. But it was all based off of a classical book for bowing, string crossing, and applying that. Not the Zimmerman. Is it the Zimmerman? The red one? Yeah, that's the Zimmerman. Yeah. So it's that book applied to the right hand.
Nice. Great.
On electric bass players. So I think there's some cool stuff in there that there's some good exercises and stuff that can be applied to electric bass players because the importance of the right hand is, I think, undervalued in relation to the right hand and playing melodically. Because of your time with Pat Metheny plays largely very legato, and he's a lot of things are connected by his left hand alone, and not every note is articulated with the right hand or his guitar pick. Exactly. Did you, when playing with Pat, did you pick up a lot of that, just like legato articulations and getting a lot of pull-offs, hammer-ons, slurs initiated with the left hand, and not everything's initiated with the right?
I did. I was very inspired by playing with Pat for that exact reason, those exact reasons, as far as playing melodies and articulation, because when he's playing, he might play with a right finger one stroke and it'll be 3 notes or 4 notes in the left hand, exactly what you said. And it's a very important way to do it, and it's also something that people forget about playing. They're just and with those articulations, becomes more vocal and more fluid. And that was something I was very aware of when we were playing with Pat Metheny. And I stepped into a bass chair which was pretty demanding, because Pat had just recorded Bright Size Life. Actually, he recorded Watercolors, but Bright Size Life was one of his records before I joined the Pat Metheny Group, and that was with Jaco and Bob Moses on it. So there was a combination of Jaco articulation, which I don't really have, and I stayed away from sounding like Jaco, even though people say, fretless bass, Marc, Jaco. But I don't think that I really sound like Jaco that much. Maybe sometimes with open swells and double stops or something, but Jaco had a very identifiable sound. And I think one of the things playing with the Pat Metheny Group, which you mentioned, Pat, that group, we were trying to get an individual sound, and we worked on it all the time. We were on the road 300 days a year. For 4 years, I was, working on it. Luckily, we were young, in our early 20s doing that, but hitting it. But that is another aspect of articulation. I'm glad you brought it up, because, even though I mentioned, doing the melodies on the open strings, there's the aspect of the left hand, right hand combination of making those more legato articulations.
When did, I don't actually know this. I'm a big Pat Metheny fan. I love his playing. The record you did, the Pat Metheny Group, with Pat Metheny, I've transcribed Pat's solos off of. I've transcribed your solos off of. Like I have it on vinyl. I listen to it regularly. Big fan of that album. When did the Pat Metheny Group become the Pat Metheny Group? Like, so it was Bright Size Life. I think that was cut in 79, if I remember correctly.
Right. So no, we did the first Metheny Group in 78. So it was probably 70. Yeah. So it was 77 or 76 was Bright Size Life. I'm not exactly sure. And then 77 was Watercolors. And that was with Eberhard Weber, who's an incredible bassist and a big influence on my sound as well, Eberhard. And and then we recorded the Pat Metheny Group record in 1978.
And was that the first Metheny Group record?
That was the
Yeah.
Metheny Group. That's when we was Lyle Mays, Danny Gottlieb,
Yeah.
myself, and Pat, and that was called
Okay.
the Pat Metheny Group. That's when he started the Pat Metheny Group.
Interesting.
Mhm.
But you spoke about Jaco. Obviously, I mean, it's hard to be a fretless bass player and not the name not come up. On the album, you have a tune called "Ode to Jaco," which is a solo bass kind of feature. Was that composed or was that improvised? Was that kind of just in the moment you performed it and it was that, or was it a melody that was written and maybe rehearsed and kind of edited along the way?
That actually, and that track is only going to be on the vinyl version. It's not on
Oh,
the
okay.
CD. There's 2 tracks. One is called "To Lou with Love," Lou
Yeah.
Skull Up with Love, and both of those were improvisations in the spirit of. I was thinking about Jaco when I did the Ode to Jaco, and I was thinking about
Sure.
my friend Lou when he passed away. So they're tributes to them,
Yeah.
and it's not the Ode to Jaco is just. If you really listen to Weather Report and his music, you'll get, da 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 da,
Yeah.
and that melody's in there. But then it's just musings about Jaco.
Sure. Very, very highly influenced.
Mhm.
This also leads me into, when did you make the jump to become a full-time, maybe not full time, but as an artist, we know you as primarily a fretless player. When did you make the jump to be that was going to be the driving force in your artistic voice?
I first heard a fretless bass, a guitar player named Stan Samoli, who was in Florida, who I was playing a lot with. I was playing bass, fretted bass, precision 68 precision fretted,
Nice.
and yeah,
Still have
and
it?
then I don't,
Ah.
but I have a 64 jazz bass
Ooh.
that I
Okay.
have that is
Yeah. All original.
all original. It's killer.
Nice. Nice.
Um, but he had a Fender fretless without any lines that Fender made a bunch of those, or in the late 60s,
The
early 70s.
maple,
Yeah.
the ones with the I
No,
love the maple
this
neck.
was a rosewood one, actually, rosewood
Okay.
neck. And I just loved it. It sounded like a little baby upright or like a cello upright or something. It was great. That's when I first heard it. And then I heard Jaco play
Hmm.
when I was in Florida. And then that was amazing. But I didn't get a fretless around that time. It wasn't until I was with the Pat Metheny Group. We were playing at the Jazz Workshop, which is a club in Boston that not a lot of national acts played at. And we were playing a week there with the Pat Metheny Group opposite Elvin Jones's band with Steve Grossman and Dave Liebman, I think.
Okay.
Heavy. They were
Is that
two.
the jazz machine? Is that what
Yeah,
I think?
Paul's
Yeah.
Mall, the Jazz Workshop. They were both downstairs. One was called the Jazz Workshop where we were playing, and to the left was Paul's Mall. But anyway, one night, Jaco had been in touch with Pat, and Pat had a bass that he got in, it was a 58 Precision that he got when he was in Missouri, in his hometown, that someone had, and he brought it down to Florida, and he gave it to Jaco to have the frets taken out to make fretless. So it was a 58 Precision maple neck.
Okay.
That's the bass that's on my recordings of Pat Metheny.
Oh,
And
okay.
we were playing at the Jazz Workshop, and Pat said, Jaco finished that bass. Why don't we call him and he can ship it up? So we went to Logan Airport in between sets, and I picked up the bass that was in an anvil case, came in, and I picked it up, and there was a little note. I wish I still had the note. It said, "Hey, Mark, here's the precision fretless. Hope you enjoy it. Jaco."
Oh man,
Yeah,
that's
classic note.
cool. Yeah,
So
yeah.
I got it, and I played the second set on that bass, and it changed the sound of the band completely, and didn't sound like Jaco. It just opened it up, and it had a wider sound and more sustain, and it just made it come to life. It was magical.
Yeah.
And so that was the beginning of me of applying my knowledge of melody and everything over to that instrument. I wasn't it because it drew me in, and it was asking for melodies. It wanted to be
Right.
played like that. Just that's how a great instrument is. And it's one thing I wanted to mention about instruments, which I'm sure you've spoken about in your teachings and your whatever your different seminars you've done here.
Mhm.
But it's so important to have an instrument that inspires you, that you want to play, that feels good, and one of those things, especially with a fretless bass, is the setup, and to make sure that the intonation is set correctly with the bridge and the nut and the intonation of each string. And you I know you know about that, but it's something that I had to learn from actually an instrument repair person taught me how to do it. And then later Mike Padula, who builds all my instruments, the Padula basses. So because you could play an open string, but if you play a double or an octave, it can be out of tune because the distance from the bridge, from the 12th fret to the bridge, is different than the distance from the 12th fret to the nut. So that has to be right on if you want to be able to rely on fret markers, which is what I do when I play. I like having the inlaid fret markers on a fretless. There's a lot of debate, whatever, but for me, if you want to play in tune, and I feel like I'm an in tune type of player, you have to rely on it. I wouldn't be able to play as in tune as I could. So anyway,
go ahead.
No, so it's really important that the bass is set up right. So not only, the intonation is correct, but also the right strings are right. I have on my Padula basses, I have an acrylic spray that's on the ebony board. So it's like glass sort of, and it gives it a lot of sustain. It's a very bright sound. And some people prefer just a plain ebony board or a maple neck or whatever. It's all individual. But for me, that's what I developed with Mike Padula with the Marc Egan signature basses. And it's all things to be aware of, and the type of strings that you use, and what experimenting with strings. And I know you've done that, and finally you find
what strings are you playing? Because I mean, I feel like I have a signature fretless that I co-built with Dan Lakin, founder of Lakeland Basses. When he started his new company, we co-built a 5-string fretless.
Great.
Yeah, it's a super fun instrument, and I'm sure, like you were talking about, instruments inspiring you to play. That bass inspires me to play a specific way, just because of
How so?
It is a very flat fingerboard, and there's something about that. It's I think originally it had 19 millimeter spacing, so the strings were a little wider than I was, by a millimeter. That I was used to, and it just felt like kind of this plank. And so upper register stuff feels really good, but then like getting a 16th note groove down here, like that's a little bit harder to get out than it would be on, my other fretted 5-string, or even, a 4-string or something. But up here it feels great, and it inspires me to play melodically, but doesn't inspire me to like have a 16th note groove thing. I had to really work on that bass of translating all my material, all my lick, my one lick, I had to translate it over to the bass to get it to happen. But I do think that every instrument inspires you to play differently because of the sound. And you speaking about, the fretless that came up, the 58, it was the 58 that was sent up.
58 precision,
yeah. Like I can't imagine how that would inspire. It's going to open up because it could have been any bass. If it was a 62 jazz that they ripped the frets out, that would have sent the music in a completely different direction.
That's right.
Because they all inspire something different, I think, in each of us.
And you have to remember that 58 precision that Jocko, he had his guy in Florida set up, but Jocko set up the string height and everything.
Yeah.
So it was Jocko's setting, and Jocko used a very low action. Action means string to the fingerboard, for people that listening that don't know. So it's something when I sat in, it was a band in Florida, Ira Sullivan's band, and Jocko came in and sat in one night, and I was listening, and then I asked him if I could just, feel his bass, and the strings were so low that you had to lighten up. And that's, if you want to be able to really play fast and articulation, I believe that you really got to have a lower action. At least from my experience, my action is very low, and I'm always tweaking the neck, because in the Northeast and even in the South, the humidity changes season to
Sure.
season, and you get a bow in the neck. That I just had to do mine from going up and doing that recording up in Connecticut. I was just tweaking my bass back in Florida here, and it was at the end I had to tweak it back a little to get the strings. The strings are just too high.
Do you have
So-
like basses, like Connecticut basses and Florida basses, or do you use the same bunch back and forth?
There's two that I play that I bring back and forth all the time, but I have
Okay.
several instruments because
Sure.
I've worked with Padula since 1981 with basses, and I have prototypes, and I have doubles and triples of each of what I have. I have a fretted and a fretless version,
Okay.
and this is my main fretless right here. This Padula one, but I bring those back and forth because they're primo. Just they're playing great, and they're set up exactly the way. So those are the ones that I'm always tweaking. But if I pick up another instrument that I haven't played, if I go back up north, I have to tweak and do it. But they're minor tweaks, but it makes a big difference for me because to get that growl on the fretless bass, especially down like on a low F on the E string first fret, if the nut's too high, first of all, you got to press harder to get down. It takes extra energy. So I use a pretty low nut up at the top of the tuning area, and then also to get that to really have a lot of sustain, more like an upright, like wow, that growl like Ron Carter. You're tweaking between straightening the neck to such a way and having that be the best height of the nut. So I'm sure these are things you all work with, when you've worked with.
You have a bone nut on that bass? Like, what's the material of the nut? Because I do think that impacts sustain and, overall sound production.
On these two basses, they are bone. And my original Padula bass, which I've played on many, many, many records, is a brass nut. And I think that brass makes more sense because you have a metal bridge and a brass nut. It's metal to metal, and that the sustain is better, and then it's not being absorbed into the nut if it was bone as much.
Right, because the brass doesn't vibrate. Like, that's going to absorb vibration.
Yes, it's more dense. Yeah. But these basses sound great, and I don't want to put brass nuts on them. I'll keep them with the bone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that the sonic difference between bone versus brass is noticeable, but it's not going to have kind of that edge to the note, because it's going to have a softer attack because some of those vibrations are being absorbed.
Exactly. Yep. Yes.
To go back to, I think, where some of this conversation started, what strings do you play on your fretless?
Yes.
That's where I meant to go
20
minutes ago.
I used the Dario XL 170.
Okay.
And it's a medium light gauge string, 100.
45 through 130?
I have a special 128 on the low B.
Oh, cool. Okay. Right, gives it a little clarity.
Yeah, and it matches the E better. It's relationship-wise, it's a little bit better.
Yeah.
Wait, is it 125 or one? It's a 125.
Okay. Yeah, that's
125. And so I've been using those since, probably 30 years, a long time.
Okay.
So they're my part of my sound. That they really make it happening.
Have you experimented with any of the nylon tape wounds? I asked this because you had referenced Upright and Ron Carter, and I know Ron had dealt with some of the nylon wraps on his Upright. Have you experimented with that on the fretless?
I have. Earlier on, I used to play nylon strings, I think Fender nylon strings, and it was okay, but it didn't. As I got more into the round wound strings, I played roto sounds for a little bit, but I found that they were very inconsistent. A set one would be just wouldn't last very long. So when I got to the Darios, that's when I really went with those, and I haven't turned back. So I haven't really experimented any. Do you have any ideas lately of what?
Man, me and Jerry Jamont have become good friends, and I was over at his place, and I was playing Diodario half wounds on my 5-string fretted for a long time. I'm not a slapper, and so I don't really want super bright. Like, I was always going to go with nickel wrap. I never wanted a steel wrap that was too bright.
Mm-hmm.
Then I got hip to these half wounds, and those were working for me. They're a little bit darker, and it had a little bit more punch to it. And I felt forced me to articulate with my hands instead of relying on the construction of the string.
I see.
So I could kind of control the articulation a little differently.
Is that what you have on your basses now?
I have those still on the fretted 5. On the fretless, I have what do I have on the fretless? I don't know. I was going back and forth with the fretless. I had it strung from E to high C for a little while. I wanted to check that out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to another bass player that my fretless is a 35-inch scale, and he's like, "Man, that's a lot of tension on a C string, And I'm like, "It's really difficult to keep the C string in tune in the upper register, like really difficult." He's like, "Yeah, man, I think it's too tense." And then I got back to the studio here, and I was playing through it, and I'm like, "Wow." Like, I don't know if it was power suggestion, but he was right. Like, I was just, going through all the strings. I'm like, yeah, there's a noticeable amount of tension on the C that's not comfortable. So I went back to B to G, and I'm still playing with it. I want to take stringing and electric bass as, I don't know if seriously is the word, but I want to put the same emphasis on it that I do with my upright, like finding a right gauge of strings, and even a hybrid, if I had, I think on my fretted, I had at one point half wounds, but then a round wound on the B because I wanted clarity down there.
What do you use on your upright?
Right now I have Parastro, Parastro obligatos on G, D, and A, and then a Tomastic on the E.
Nice.
Yeah, so I'm always playing around with it, to try to find some kind of concoction that I think works. After this, I'm probably going to go check out the 125s. Like, let me see. Marc Egan uses it. I'm definitely going to check it out.
It to me, the 125, the low B, has a tonality to it. It has a sound to it. It's not just a thud,
Right.
So it to me, it makes sense. But I do like the nickel round, the XL 170 nickel round. Yep.
Yeah. All the tone talk leads me to, what was your signal chain in the studio? Which bass did you play, and what pre's did you use? Did you use a cab? Did you just go direct? What was the process there on your bass sound?
Yep. Well, I use these Padula basses. This one back here, that's the fretless 5-string, and I went from that into a radial direct boxes, two radial direct boxes. It depended on the song. On some things, I used some stereo chorusing. I use a TC, an old black TC chorus, stereo chorus. But the signal chain basically was from my bass into the direct box and then into a Neve console, 8038, 8068 console at the studio. No real, a little bit of compression, but not that much, because the Padula basses for me sort of have a natural compression sound to them. And the way that I play is fairly consistent. There's not a lot of things. And whenever I'm doing a sound check at the studio, I'll play notes, really hit pretty hard on the low end, on the low B, to get that, see if that low end distorts at all.
Yeah.
And play the full range of the bass to make sure that we're not getting any overloads before we do it. So that was basically the chain. And I've been using the radial direct boxes that have the Jensen transformers for a long time, since they first came out. And I like them. And also, I did some overdubbing, post overdubbing at my studio, some melodies, because we didn't have time to do everything during those recording sessions. So I wanted to have the same sound. And I have some Neve EQs at my studio that I used that matched up fine with it. So that's the way I like to bring in my own direct boxes when I go to any studio. I have 2 of those.
Okay, the radials?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool, man. Marc, we'll be in touch for sure.
Okay, thank you so much, Ryan. It was a pleasure.
All right.
Yo, this is Craig Gash. Subscribe to the podcast. Follow us on the Instagram, the YouTube. Leave us a comment.
All right. That was my talk with Marc Egan. His latest album is titled Cross Currents, which is a fantastic album. I highly recommend that. I will have links to the album and Marc Egan's website in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. Yeah, a really great record. And Marc and I were emailing after the interview a little bit, and he asked me to send him a copy of my record, and that was a surreal experience, right? That was a surreal experience to send Marc Egan a copy of my record. He had some beautiful, very, very sweet words to say about it, and thank you, Marc. Thanks for checking out the record. Thanks for being on the podcast. Absolute honor, and I look forward to having Marc back on the podcast anytime he's got news to share with the bass community. All right, folks. That's about all I got for this one. I will catch you on the next one in a minute.